The Arcadion is one of, if not the most memorable raid series in Final Fantasy XIV history. It combines a fun concept with showmanship, varied set pieces, and some of the most original boss fights the game has ever seen. It's fair to say that I've been interested for a long time in how they reached certain decisions in the design process, why they opted to commit to specific themes and mechanics in the process of actually making an FF14 Savage raid. Conveniently enough, a couple of recent interviews with Famitsu magazine helped to shed some light on it, as they've had an extensive talk with the designers of the most recent Arcadion Heavyweight raid tier. Today, we're going to talk about it. I've linked this interview in the description as well, so if you want to read up on it yourself, you can. And please do bear in mind that for this video I used a mixture of machine translation as well as clarification from Japanese speakers on points that didn't really seem clear based off that machine translator. It might not be 100% perfect, but it's as close as I can do. If you do want to support conversations about FF14, please do consider subscribing. Now, there were actually 2 interviews conducted covering the same overarching topic, with one touching a lot more on general raid philosophy, and the other far more specifically diving into decisions they made in regards to Heavyweight itself. This interview includes input from Takeshi Yokozawa, the assistant director of FF14, Takeo Kujiraoka, who worked on Vamp Fatale but is also known as the FF16 combat designer and a battle planner for both Dissidia and Final Fantasy XIII, Kazuto Yoshihashi, who designed M10, Tomohiro Iwatsuki, who took control of M11 and also handled a large chunk of Cruiserweight and half of Light Heavyweight, and Mr. Moritor, whom handled Lindworm. And I'm so sorry if I butchered any of those names, I am not a Japanese speaker, I did my best. This is going to be formatted by covering each Savage flaw and what was mentioned about them before moving onwards to overarching concepts. Of course that means that first of all, we'll need to talk about Vamp Fatale. He first mentioned that often the scenario group will request certain aspects or features to fit the character they are creating, but that often, from there, the designers have free rein to open out whatever they want from that point onwards. On this note, they said that as an easy to understand feature of bats, I wanted to include elements of blood-sucking and ultrasonic waves. However, if you use the blood as it is, it will be a vivid expression, so I replaced it with the element of ether unique to FF14. In addition to that, there was an element called sadistic in the scenario group's request, so I tried to include a production that sucks ether not only from the player but also from the audience. If you're a fanatic of Vamp Fatale, even breathing the ether will be pleasant, and the attack will be strengthened by sucking the ether from all over the venue. They then discuss the small circular AoE puddles that spawn a bunch throughout the fight, and could easily be seen as filler. He says that it was decided from the planning stage that the number of appearances would be increased, rather than increasing the size of the circles. However, in the original idea, the frequency of these circle AoE attacks was quite high. In the published version, the number of attacks has been significantly reduced. In general, in earlier design, unless it's impossible to work around, the boss would shoot out circular AoEs whenever she unleashed her ether, such as during Vamp Stomp. This was removed due to being too hard during playtesting for a first floor, though I can very much see the vision. The first ad phase was originally harder as well. An earlier version had an additional RNG mechanic where Vamp Fatale might go to the other side of the arena before doing the second part of her kick, thus meaning you need to maintain the same north or south position instead of swapping all the time. This was also removed for being too difficult. This lines up with a common threadline in Savage mechanical design. The fight begins by being too difficult, and then they tone back necessary elements to make it more palatable to a wider player base. He also discusses etherletting, the mechanic that quickly saw the strat of just spread out to the edges and drop them and then go to the middle, dominate practically every group. During development, they were aware that this strat was theoretically possible, though made it clear that this was not their intentional resolution by design. I can actually show you the intended solution because that's exactly what my group did in prog. You split into light parties, and you drop the puddles rotating around the arena, following the pizza slice AoEs. Then, you just rotate as a group, dodging each pair as they go off effectively. It's still simple and fun to perform, but it does have this added layer of depth. They thought about blocking off the center, but he had this to say. There is a premise that the solution of making the center the safe zone will not be established unless the foreshadowing attack is placed carefully and properly on the outside of the arena. So I think that I was able to feel the excitement of whether it can really be avoided or not. In addition to that, it was exhilarating and good to see consecutive attacks being protruding to avoid the middle beautifully. And I decided as a result there was no problem as it was. I think what he's saying here is that even with the middle strat, the execution is still something tight. You need to carefully position those AoEs, and then it looks very satisfying as it all executes, which is very true. He discussed the mechanic near the end too, where players are chained to a bat and must rotate around, following their winged buddy, and confirmed that it was intentionally designed for players to have to, at one point, do a two-step dodge, upping the complexity just enough to make sure it isn't comfortable. There was originally more to this mechanic too, though layers were peeled back to make it a little more manageable. They have a basic policy to not put new gimmicks being what Japanese developers call mechanics, also Japanese players call them gimmicks, near the end of a fight, as power increase means that they won't be seen after progression. That's why the very last mechanic is just a simple conal left-right dodge of the pizza slices. There was a version where this also had a light party or partner stack associated with it. Then, Yoshihashi discussed the extremes and their theming, stating, in Cruiserweight, there were dancers and graffiti artists, so I imagined that there would be athletes in Solution 9. From there, I came up with various sports ideas, mainly ball games and athletics. Among them, there was a request and an idea that he plays a heel role. So, I thought about what sports, with a so-called naughty image there would be, and I felt like I quickly reached extreme sports. There are various kinds of extreme sports, such as BMXing and snowboarding, but I thought that the appearance of the two of them riding on the waves together seemed to be very cool, so I packed it with the setting of the bosses doing surfing. When I first consulted with the designer about the background, I told him that the idea of generating a big wave and riding the wave was essential. How high the waves are, and in order to guarantee this amount of momentum, it is necessary to do this huge arena size, and I had the design recalculated in reverse. Interestingly, he also touched on what I feel is one of the most interesting aspects of the encounter, the fact that there are no firewalls and that both enemies can be targeted. He said, at first, there were restrictions as usual. However, as we proceed with development, there is a timing where the boss will temporarily join and be cleavable, but according to the gimmick, it is naturally divided into two teams, and there is no need to bother adding debuffs. Rather, it feels interesting if you can enjoy it as part of the player's ingenuity, such as changing the opponent to attack depending on the situation by eliminating restrictions, or attacking the two bodies together well. Regarding the jail ad phase late into the fight, the initial design for the water prison section assumed healers would go into the jail, as the phase had far more outgoing damage during initial development. As this was changed, and the healing burden eased, they realised it would be possible for anybody, such as a black mage, to go into the prison, and decided that that was fine too. They wanted the player base to have agency on how they handled it, so they didn't increase restrictions. The massive fire conal AoEs were expanded in size during development too, as Yokozawa stated that although I had the concept of the field becomes a sea of fire on the floor, I did not get the impression that what we were presenting was a sea of fire. Therefore, we extended the range attack to 330 degrees and performed extensive adjustments until the end of development. I think it became an impressive boss, including the impact of its appearance, so I think that it was able to land in a very good way in the end. Next came Iwatsuki's discussion about the development of the Tyrant Savage, a flaw that has been hotly debated and considered by a section of the player base as being quote-unquote too difficult. He responded to that immediately, saying, I did not think about making it particularly tighter, but I had the intention of making it comparable to the previous third turns. He wanted to maintain the usual third floor notion of being a tough DPS check that required tight positioning amongst fast-paced simple mechanics. As your skill improves, you should be able to greed on more things like the weapons, he noted, which will ease any kind of DPS requirement. The weapons themselves were chosen by what would feel intuitive to see and respond to. He explained, the aim was to make it feel good as a play experience to understand the shape of the weapon and what kind of attack is drawn out from it intuitively to some extent. For example, if it was an axe, it would be a slam, and if it was a scythe, it would be a sweeping attack. I decided on the weapon type from this kind of idea. One thing I found really interesting actually was his reference to Orbital Omen, an attack which I on release felt was incredibly fast for FF14 telegraphs, despite intrinsically being really simple, just dodge line AoEs. He said that at first, the time when the gate appeared around the outside was a little longer, and there was more space between them. However, it became so easy that it floats as essentially being a non-mechanic. This is a little relaxing phase, but I decided that it is better to make it a gimmick that challenges with a little more tension, and I scrapped the grace period and made it how it is now. A discussion was also had about arena split, as the interviewer straight up asked if the marker-based strategy was intended by the developers. Iwatsuki replied that no. The strategy based on the field markers that are now mainstream is not the solution that was assumed during the development. In fact, as you can guess, at the beginning of the project, I was thinking of another solution. But during test play, a strategy proposed was that it may be possible to fix the movement to some extent in both east and west. Therefore, when I actually tried the strat using field markers as a landmark, I was convinced that this solution would be popular in the public world because it was simple, so I adopted it as an internal strategy for development. Since the arrangement of the gates varies from east to west, it was assumed that the safe zone would be widely adopted by determining the standing position with each pattern. However, if you do so, you have to learn about 4 patterns in total, so even if the standing position becomes somewhat strict and severe, it is more stable to unify the movement in the east and west. As a result, I think that the strategy that is currently the mainstream is the most efficient solution. The final mechanic, Ecliptic Stampede, also received adjustments. The last meteor mechanic was meant to be a moderate difficulty victory lap. Initially, there are only 2 arrangements of the 4 towers, and the 2-way or 4-way stack was always only 4-way. These were changed a little to provide more difficulty. Tyrant also received pretty big alterations to his design even, as you can see some earlier iterations of his character design here. Yokozawa stated that this too would influence the battle if he looked different, and that the early art of the Tyrant looked completely different. If this had been the case, I think it would have been completely different content. Not only the techniques to use, but also the stage and the structure of the battle. I have that art in my hands. In the process of pursuing more themes, we evolved into the current design, but I was glad that I had the opportunity to unveil this unexpectedly. Then, Morita would discuss M12S with the interviewer. He said that the theme of the first half of the phase is abnormal regenerative ability and the serpentine qualities it possesses. The second half of the phase is based on the concept of infinite growth and reproduction. He expanded that the reproduction theme was one he added rather than a request from the scenario team. It was evident that Idyllic Dream would be discussed at length, and the topic was broached with a conversation about why exactly it was a checkpoint fight in the first place. He said that this is because there was an Idyllic Dream in the second half of the phase. In fact, there were originally 2 Idyllic Dreams. That's why it was really hard to do the second half. So I decided to put a checkpoint from the beginning. It is far easier to adjust and alter each one as much as possible if it is divided into 2 separate encounters. What he's saying is that tuning is far easier. Morita also mentioned something interesting that we can clearly see reflected in the final encounter, that he was deliberate in giving uptime positions for every mechanic in Phase 1. This is something you'll notice upon doing the fight, though it definitely feels that some other Arcadion encounters have somewhat moved away from this design decision. Uptime is usually attainable, but not clearly signposted and telegraphed on the most challenging mechanics, and this decision in M12SP1 almost feels like a bit of a holdover from older expansions and design styles. The fight only has one downtime mechanic, and Morita states if it is only one pattern, it becomes a very simple gimmick. So I feel like I made another pattern to have you need to judge on which parts of the arena to go out on. This is actually something we're definitely seeing more and more, and we've seen it referenced a lot today as well. The decision to take a simple mechanic and add additional patterns to increase progression time and ensure that it's befitting the level of challenge for Savage. I think this is also a way to increase playability. You get this fight and each pull is more likely to be different because there are more different patterns to deal with, so when you're going back in for your weekly reclears, you're likely having a more interesting time. At the end of the fight, there's a short phase where you're stacking or spreading, and Lindworm is summoning knockback or dodge arms in order, and honestly, it's a bit of a mess to visually decipher. Morita said that I was quite conscious of this. In that scene, you need to first check the overhead marker and quickly decide whether to go left or right, and while doing it, you will see which arm of the boss has been used first. I made this on purpose. It's a very messy scene, so I'm sorry that the boss's arm has become difficult to see. However, I wanted to do it here so that while responding to other gimmicks, you have to watch the boss intently. But I think the most interesting tidbit comes in regards to Idyllic Dream. Morita said that development was a real struggle. Among all content that I have designed, Idyllic Dream has an incredible data volume and is probably the single most complex mechanic of all of them. There was a 2-month gap between writing the design document and it becoming able to playtest. When it finally came to playtest it, I found myself saying, how does this mechanic go again? And I had to retread the entire design documentation. Even when I gave a presentation to other development members at the planning stage, nobody understood it verbally alone, and everybody was just silent from beginning to end during my explanation. Morita also explained the fight to their supervisor Yokozawa, and it took multiple attempts to get the idea across. The designer was aware that macros and quick panel usage might be the standardized way to solve it. When the designer himself plays, he says he doesn't use those and instead just repeats what he has to do under his breath. Then, Yokozawa, who oversaw the entire development of the raid tier, attempted to summarize the tier and its reception, in which he said that the Arcadion series has received a very good response overall, and I think that each person in charge worked on the production under great pressure. As a director, and as one of the players who played the tier on the public server, I strongly felt that they all created wonderful content. As for Heavyweight, I think it was appropriate as a finishing point for the series, because I settled down to the right feeling of challenge every week, even from the point of view of difficulty. The popularity of the fighters who appear was also very strong, and it was a really good season of raiding, including being well received by the player base. The next is 8.0, and it's important to know that we have to create something that goes beyond this. At the recent fan festival in North America, Yoshida made various major announcements about the future of FF14, and I think that it is time for the development team to make a major change. I think that it was not a small time. As for the battle, the evolution of the armory system in evolved mode from the system side is greatly improved. However, not all things will be revamped, of course, and as a content group, I would like to continue working firmly with awareness that there are two sides to unchanging fun and new experiences making the game more interesting. For me personally, I'm going to miss Arcadion a lot, and I know I've voiced concerns before that Square Enix Encounter developers may not just be able to top what they accomplished here as a full package. With that said, it is lovely to know that they are aware this expansion's raid struck gold, and that they're committed to more and better in the future. For me, I cannot wait to see it. But there was also another interview, touching less specifically on encounters and more on overall design philosophy, and I wanted to share just a few of the tidbits that I found most interesting from that. They discuss things such as one developer's move from the FF16 team over to the FF14 team as development wrapped up on that title, for example, which I haven't included in this video. As always, the interview is linked so you can view the full thing yourself in order to get any context that may be missed if you want to. Speaking of Kuji Rauka, which is who I was referencing in regards from swapping from FF16 to FF14, M9S was his first Savage design, having joined the FF14 team in 2024, coming off of combat design and the DLC director positions on Final Fantasy XVI. Other things he's designed include the Dead Stars fight in the Forked Tower, and Sephiroth from Kingdom Hearts 2. The job adjustments in patch 7.2 through to 7.4, such as Black Mage, which was specifically referenced, were done to help the jobs fit the content that was being designed. The approach taken this time was to adjust jobs to fit the content. Usually, the opposite is true. The job system is in place first, and then after that, content is created to fit the specifications of what already exists. Yokozawa said that the timing of the completion of the heavyweight draft this time was before the release of Cruiserweight, and the finalization of the plan was around the time immediately after the release of the Cruiserweight tier. Therefore, you can see the reaction of everybody immediately after the release, but it's difficult to reflect the feedback received at a certain timing after that. In addition, it is not uncommon for the feeling to change with playing immediately after the release versus a few weeks or months after the release, so I need to judge feedback very carefully. I find it very interesting that they've gotten to such a point of efficiency where plans for the next tier are finalised before the release of the previous one even occurs, but it's clear that they're right. This makes it harder to course correct immediately if something is received poorly, and I think something the community has kind of accepted at this point is that if course correction needs to occur, it'll likely be 2 to 3 patches after, rather than the smaller timeline of 1 to 2. He also confirmed that the DPS check of Heavyweight did take into account the 3 extra weeks of tomestones. A discussion was also had about the communication between the scenario team and the battle design team, specifically noting what kind of information they'd received to begin building encounters themselves. One quote I'm going to read is, "The race of the boss character and some settings were always passed on. In terms of the one turn I was in charge of, it is like a sadistic atmosphere with an Elizan woman. Several candidates were presented with the options of feral souls, and I was told I would be happy if you could choose from among them." Morita added that the setting of the 4th turns were specifically determined, and I received concrete requests, such as, "I want Lindworm to be a big snake," or "I want you to make it a battle with the theme of regenerative ability." Candidates for M9S's feral soul were creatures that people generally dislike, such as bats, spiders, and scorpions. Spiders would have overlapped too much with P10S Pandemonium, and scorpions, they said, would have been quote-unquote kind of weird, so bats it was. Scorpions were also considered to be too poisonous. M11S was between Behemoth and Deathgaze. Even though Behemoth is now a very common motif in FF14, they went with it in the end, and the designer decided to incorporate meteors in practically every attack in the second half of the encounter, instead of just having the usual drop-down meteor occur once or twice. I have 2 things to say. Firstly, Square Enix, please let me talk to somebody about job design before Evercold and do an interview. Oh my gosh. I know it's never going to happen, but I would love that so much. There's so much I want to ask. Not even like specifics, not things like how does this job work, but just how do you make the decisions you make. That would be so interesting. Even not with me, with anyone. I just want to hear it. And secondly, I would love to see more open discussions like this with the developers, so that players can more easily put a name and sometimes face to those that create their favorite pieces of content, because to me this was so interesting. Yoshida doesn't need to be the only public-facing representative Square Enix has, and I hope this is something that we continue to see expanded on in the future, as we have done over the past year or so. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to support the channel, please do consider becoming a patron or a YouTube member like these fine folk. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.